Strikes a person mortally shall be put to death. If it was not premeditated, but came by an act of God, then I will appoint a place for you to which the killer may flee. But if someone willfully attacks and kills another by treachery, you shall take the killer from my altar for execution. Whoever strikes father or mother shall be put to death. Whoever kidnaps a person, whether the person has been sold or is still held in possession, shall be put to death. Whoever curses father or mother shall be put to death. When individuals quarrel and one strikes the other with a stone or a fist, so that the injured party, though not dead, is confined to a bed, but recovers and walks around outside with the help of a staff, then the assailant shall be free of liability. That is, they're not to be put to death, except they have to pay for the loss of time and to arrange for full recovery. So they're on the hook for the medical expenses. When a slave owner strikes a male or a female slave with a rod and the slave dies immediately, the owner shall be punished. But if the slave survives a day or two, there is no punishment, for the slave is the owner's property. When people who are fighting injure a pregnant woman so that there's a miscarriage, yet no further harm follows, the one responsible shall be fined what the woman's husband demands, paying as much as the judges determine. If any harm follows, then you shall, go ahead, next slide, shall give life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, bruise for bruise. That's just a little snippet of the Old Covenant, a set of 613 rules that are found in the section of the Bible that we call the Old Testament. And I have a question for you this morning. My question is, are disciples of Jesus required to follow the rules in the Old Testament? Are disciples of Jesus required to follow the 10 commandments? So those are the first 10, but then there's 603 that follow. How many think that we, if you're a disciple of Jesus, are required to follow the 10 commandments? Don't be shy. Yeah, we have a few. Yeah. Now, could you write them all down? Right? Most of us, we have a deep sense that we should follow these commandments, yet we don't know them. And so hence we have a problem, but really we don't have a problem if you're a disciple of Jesus and you understand the ramifications of the new covenant that Jesus came to bring. So my answer to this question, are disciples of Jesus required to follow the rules found in the Old Testament? The answer is no. Now, before you leave, okay, let me give you an explanation. Let me explain why the 10 commandments are not rules that you're required to follow as a disciple of Jesus, if you claim to be that. The first reason is this: the rules are part of an agreement, something called a covenant, with Israel, not with you. If you were actually to read the context of the text, you would discover that the context is the context of God making an agreement with a nation, not an individual, and with Israelites, not Gentiles. So unless you are an ancient Jew, this agreement is not made with you. Second reason, Israel broke the covenant and God claimed it was being replaced. Over and over and over, the Israelites break the covenant that God made with them, and then God begins to signal that it's going to be replaced. Your Bible is divided up into two parts: 39 books of the Old Testament, or the Hebrew Bible, 27 books in the New Testament, or the Christian scriptures. Way back in the second book of the Bible, the book of Exodus, we hear about the Old Covenant. It starts in Exodus 20. That's where you get the 10 commandments. And then you get the first round of laws that are given through the next several chapters. You just heard a little bit of that from Exodus 21. At the end of it, Moses, he asks the people, do you agree to this covenant? And the people say, yes, we agree. And so what Moses does is he takes an animal and he sacrifices it, and he takes some of the blood and he puts it on the altar, and then he takes some of the blood and he splashes it on the people. Imagine if I splashed blood on you next week. Gross, right? Who would come back? But that was the context of that day and age. And then see all those yellow books under the Old Testament and the red? The red indicate like the Psalms and the Proverbs. Most of those books are telling the story of how the people over and over and over again failed to keep the Old Covenant. And then all those blue books under the 39 books of the Old Testament, those are the prophets. And that's God's response to the breaking of the old covenant, and he's not very happy. And in some of those, like in Isaiah and Ezekiel and others, God begins to suggest, God begins to predict, God begins to communicate through the prophets that something new is coming. Jeremiah 31 is the most explicit. It says, "The days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant." It's not going to be like the old covenant that he made with the people after he delivered them from Egypt that was on stone tablets. It's going to be written on their hearts. It's not going to be like the old covenant that was mediated through priests. It's going to be available to every single person. And the basis of this new covenant is going to be God's unlimited, unilateral, unconditional forgiveness. The days are coming. The third reason that the 10 Commandments don't apply to you if you're a follower of Jesus is that Jesus claims that he finishes the old covenant. He brings it to its conclusion. We're going to look at that text in just a little bit. And he claims to start the new covenant. And when he claims to start the new covenant, that is a moment that we celebrate here once a month on the first Sunday of every month, when we pass out the little piece of bread and the little cup, when we remember the Last Supper. Because on his last night with his disciples, Jesus, he takes a piece of bread, or he takes a cup and he says, "This is the cup of the new covenant in my blood." Moses sealed the covenant with the blood of a sacrificed animal, but this covenant is going to be sealed with my blood. And indeed, he would bleed on the cross. And he says it's poured out for all of you. Roughly 30 years later, an anonymous writer who writes a book that's called Hebrews, it's in your New Testament, he makes this claim about the new covenant. By calling this covenant new, he has made the first one obsolete. And what is obsolete and outdated will soon disappear. That's one part of your Bible, calling another part of your Bible obsolete. And obsolete and disappear it would. In 70 AD, the Romans would come in and they would destroy the temple all the way to the ground. One wall remains. You can go there. It's called the Wailing Wall or the Western Wall. I've been there. It's in Jerusalem today. But other than that wall, pretty much everything is gone. And when the temple is gone, the old covenant religion is gone. Because if you actually read the 613 laws that we've just assumed or been taught apply to us as Christians, you would find that a whole bunch of them detail what you're supposed to do at the temple, how you're supposed to bring a sacrifice, and how many times a year, and the conditions of all that. But when the temple was gone, the old covenant faded away. Now, this is relevant to all of us because many people walk away from the church because they feel it is outdated and obsolete. We are in a historical decline of the church. It's not just the mainline church. It's not just the more progressive churches, the evangelicals, the Catholics. Everybody is seeing a decline. And I care about this because I've experienced church to be outdated and obsolete, and I think other people have too. It just feels like the church is for like another people in another place in another time. And so this is such a big deal that we are in the 7th week of a sermon series titled The Most Important Story You've Never Been Told. And it's the story of the transition from the old covenant to the new covenant. And specifically how the mixing and blending of mindsets and rules and laws from the old covenant into the new has made the new something other than what Jesus brought to bear. And I believe that the parts that make the church feel outdated and obsolete should have never been part of the church in the first place. Should have never been part of the church in the first place. The parts that make Christians judgmental and hypocritical should have never been part of the church in the first place. The parts that make churches just stuck in a way of doing church that is no longer working should have never been part of the church in the first place. We are part of the new covenant people. And it's been the mixing and blending and integrating of old covenant ideas and theologies into the new that has made the church feel outdated and obsolete. And so we're trying to rediscover what it means to be part of the new covenant. Now, some of you are thinking, how should we think about the rules in the Old Testament? How many people are first children or the oldest? Right? So these are the typical rule followers, and you're wondering, what about the rules? And some of you might be thinking, I see, Pastor Scott's been kind of open that he comes from more of a liberal theological background. He trends Democrat, so he's probably just going to get up here and preach a free love, no rules hippie Jesus. But that's not what I'm here to preach, because that's not the Jesus that I follow, and I would never, ever suggest that you follow that version either. So what about the rules? If the 10 Commandments, of all things, the 10 Commandments don't apply to us, they're not required by us as followers of Jesus, what about the rules? Because society needs rules. We can't all just drive on whatever side of the street that we want. What about the rules? And so we're going to look to the words of Jesus. So we're in Matthew chapter 5, the Sermon on the Mount. We were in this wonderful collection of teachings from Jesus last week. So if you missed last week, we actually had trouble with the sermon audio, but we're going to try to get that up. I suggest you at least go back and read the Beatitudes, these 8 statements where Jesus begins to outline the attitude and the perspective of somebody who's a follower of the new covenant. But today's about rules, and so here's what Jesus has to say. Do not think that I've come to abolish the law or the prophets. Law and prophets is Jesus' way of talking about the old covenant. Okay, that's his lingo for it. I've not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. Now, to abolish them would be to take away their value, would be to say that they never should have existed in the first place. And Jesus definitely doesn't believe that. The old covenant was necessary, it was God ordained, it was valuable, but it was temporary. That's the view of Jesus and the view of the New Testament writers. He hasn't come to abolish them, he's come to fulfill them, to bring them to their completion and prepare the way for what comes next. Jesus goes on, he says, "For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of a pen, not a jot or a tittle," for you King James Version people, "will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished." It's going to be in play until everything is accomplished. What needs to be accomplished? Well, all the things of Jesus' ministry. He needs to go from village to village, town to town, preaching the good news about God's kingdom has come here on earth, that it's near, that it's at hand. He needs to gather a group of disciples, these 12 ragtag rejects, and train them to be the leaders of the new church movement that he's going to start. He needs to ultimately go to Jerusalem, where he's going to face down the corrupt religious authorities of his day and age. He's not going to run from them when they make it clear that they're going to kill him, nor is he going to take up arms and return evil for evil, violence for violence. Rather, he is going to go and sacrifice his life on a cross. When all that's accomplished, then the new covenant is in play. But during the life of his ministry, the old covenant is still applying. So Jesus actually sits at the center of God's change from dealing with humanity in one way to another. He is the hinge on which the two covenants hang. This is why Jesus is so important historically, if you believe the perspective of the New Testament writers. He is literally at the center of history. He goes on, "Therefore, anyone who sets aside one of the least of these commands and teaches others accordingly will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever practices and teaches these commands will be called great in the kingdom of heaven." The problem with the commands or the old covenant is not the commands in the covenant, it's the fact that the people never practiced them. And eventually God decided to shift to something new, something better, built on better promises and a better way of being. We're going to look at that in a moment. But first, Jesus has to say something that would be incredibly confusing if you didn't understand the context of all this. "For I tell you, unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven." And that's confusing. It's confusing because it seems that Jesus is saying that we have to be better rule followers than the best rule followers. Because the Pharisees are the rock stars of rule followers. They have 613 written laws. That's how many laws are in the Old Covenant. But they came up with more rules than that. There's a whole oral tradition on top of the written tradition. And these guys took it serious. And anybody that didn't, they judged them and they condemned them and they were out to get them. The Apostle Paul was one of these Pharisees that was out to get anybody that was threatening this system of rules. Is Jesus saying that we got to be better rule followers than that? Is that what it means to have a righteousness that surpasses the Pharisees? That's not what he means. And thankfully, Jesus is a master communicator. And so he offers us 6 examples of what it looks like to have a righteousness that surpasses that of the Pharisees, to have something better than simply following a set of rules. Now, we don't have time for all these, but we're going to start with murder. And here's what he says. You have heard it was said to people long ago, you shall not murder, and anyone who murders will be subjected to judgment. Now, that's in the Old Covenant. That's a pretty famous one. But I tell you that anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subjected to judgment. Anyone who says, you fool, will be in danger of the fire of hell. Now, that feels pretty extreme. I mean, if this is the new rule, who among us would be able to keep that? Because we all have anger, don't we? I mean, we all experience threats, and anger is the emotional response to a threat or an injustice in our life. It just is. We all experience anger. But Jesus is trying to teach us something about the nature of things. He's basically saying that if you manage your anger, you don't need a rule forbidding murder. Because out of the heart, Jesus teaches, out of the heart come the things of the hands. Out of the heart comes the things that we say. If you manage your heart, then the things that come out of your mouth or the things you do with your hands will be good. But if your heart is rotten, ultimately you'll engage in destructive behavior. And the Pharisees, the rule keepers among us, were always worried about external circumstances. But what we already know is you can change your external circumstances, and that will be good for a little while. But lasting change, real happiness, it comes from renovating the heart. And we all experience anger. But if you choose to be aware of your anger, if you choose to manage your anger, if you choose to give it proper and healthy expressions rather than to lead you and determine what you're going to do, then you don't need a rule about murdering. It's better than a set of rules. It's getting to the heart of the matter, literally. The next one is adultery. Jesus says this. You ever heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery, but I tell you, anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Now, I think that this goes for men and women. Jesus lives in a patriarchal society, so he's talking about men here. Maybe the men need to hear this more than the women, but we've all, men and women, wherever you are in life's journey, you've looked at somebody lustfully. And Jesus says, if you will manage your heart, you don't need a rule about adultery. If this is just a rule, another rule for us to follow, we're in trouble, aren't we? But Jesus, he's going beyond just simply rules. He wants to get to the issue at hand. And the issue is your heart. Either manage your heart or lust will cause your relationship to fall apart. But those that are aware of their lust for other people and that are taking it seriously and in managing it and keeping it healthy and appropriate, they will never even get close to committing adultery. Jesus goes on after this, and he says that if your eye causes you to sin, gouge it out, right? Some very literal interpreters of the Bible have taken that seriously. That's not the way to take it. But he's pressing upon us that if your eye causes you to sin, gouge it out. If your hand causes you to sin, cut it off. And what he's trying to tell you is that the issues of the heart are such a big deal that you don't want to let yourself even to get there. Mike Pence has been made fun of because of he won't dine with anybody that's not his wife or be close to any of them. And I don't personally hold that policy for myself, but I get it. Because what Mike Pence understands about that is that many of politicians have had their careers ruined by inappropriate contact with the opposite sex. And they don't even have to do anything. The allegation can cause it. That's how serious some of these issues are. If you have to cut off a hand or you have to change behavior to manage your heart, then do it. You don't need a set of rules. Get to the heart of the matter. Now we're going to go to revenge. And Jesus says this about revenge. He says, you have heard it was said, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, which you have heard just a few minutes ago when I read it to you. You've heard it was said, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. And this is controversial. This is a hard teaching. Because some of us, we take it to the extreme where we think, well, if somebody's beat me with a baseball bat, I'm just supposed to turn the other cheek and take it? Somebody's out to get me and damage me and just destroy me, I'm just supposed to roll over? Is that what he's saying? I don't think that's what he's saying. He's talking about something that is far more consistent in your life, something you deal with all the time. It's right here. and slaps you. A slap is about an insult, not injury. Back in Jesus' time, those who had power would put others in their place by slapping them, and it was a backhanded slap. It was like a pimp slap, like in today's day and age, right? Just put them in their place. Who do you think you are? I'm going to put you in your place. And Jesus is saying, if somebody does that to you, somebody insults you, just let them insult you again. Somebody dishonors you, let them dishonor you again. And who can do that? Only people that understand their value in the kingdom could allow that to happen. It's kind of like the I'm rubber and you're glue, whatever you say to me bounces off me and sticks to you mentality. Like, I have such a good understanding, such a solid understanding of my place in God's kingdom. I am a humble person. I have a proper evaluation of my status in the kingdom. And so when you insult me or dishonor me, it does not affect me. So go ahead, try again. And the other word that we need to look at is this word resist. And this word is one of those words that are complex in terms of translation. So the Greek word anthistemi, it can be translated as do not respond violently. And people who do word studies on this, and I did one, they find out that the majority of the time that this word that is translated resist in our English Bibles is used, it has the context of military resistance, of violent resistance. And Walter Wink, who's a scholar that I love, he translated it this way. He says, don't mirror evil. Do not return insult for insult, dishonor for dishonor, no more tit for tat violence. Don't resist violently. Don't resist in kind. If they insult you, you don't insult back. If they dishonor you, you don't dishonor back. If they slander your name, you don't go and slander their name. The old way of doing things was eye for eye, tooth for tooth, dishonor. But this is a new way. This is a better way. This is based on something else other than a set of rules, something better. He goes on to talk about enemies. And that one on revenge, it kind of sets up this next one. These two go together. And he says this, you've heard it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. Now, love your neighbor is part of those 613 laws. It's Leviticus 19:18. You can look it up. Hate your enemies is not. It's not written anywhere. But it was the mentality of the day. They had this group of enemies called the Romans, and they hated them. And anybody that collaborated with them, they hated. That's why Matthew, who was one of the disciples, who was a tax collector, therefore a collaborator with the Romans, would have been hated by all of Jesus' disciples. Which is why when Jesus called Matthew to follow him, all of his disciples would have thought about leaving the movement, because how in the world could you call one of these people we hate? Well, here's how. Jesus says, love your enemies. I want you to take a different approach to your enemies. And you're thinking maybe you don't have enemies. But sure you do. You at least got somebody that annoys you at the office. You at least have a relative that you struggle to connect with. There's people in your life that are difficult to deal with. There's people in your life that you struggle with that you just rather have out of your life. And instead of going tooth for tooth, eye for eye with them, Jesus says, I want you to love your enemies. Now, how in the world are you able to love your enemies? Well, Jesus tells you. It's really simple. Pray for those who persecute you. And I know. This is such a churchy answer, isn't it? All you need to do is pray, right? Of course the pastor's going to say that. But if you're thinking that, then perhaps you don't understand what prayer does. And you don't understand how to pray. Because prayer prepares your heart. It looks like this. I have this enemy at the office, and I can't stand him. And all I see is all the things that he does wrong and how he never gets his assignment done. And so therefore I have to pick up the slack, and he's always late and he's always talking trash. And that's all I see. But Lord, I know that he is your child just like I'm your child. That there's more to this person than what I see. That at the core, all human beings are created good because you created us. And so I'm trying to see it, Lord. And I know that you called me to be a peacemaker. And I believe your son Jesus, that this is the way to life. And that I'm only okay because somebody gave me grace. And when you pray, you prepare your heart, you start forming your heart so that when you show up and you deal with that person, the way you show up is different Because most of us, we let our anger run the day, don't we? And we think about all the things they had said. We all think about all the things they might say. And we think about all the things we want to say, right? And ooh, we cook it up. And we're prepared. And I'm ready to unleash on that person. And I wrote it down like 5 times. Prayer will prepare your heart. It's deadly serious. It will change you. Now, why do all this? Is it because there's some rules that say you should do it? Is it because God is going to get you if you don't? Why would we do this? Why would we love our enemies? Why would we stop the eye for eye, tooth for tooth? I mean, so many of our Hollywood action films are based on revenge. They're awesome, you know? Like, why would we step away from this way of being in the world? Well, Jesus gives us the one and only answer. So that you may be children of your Father in heaven. Here's your motivation. Here's the standard. Or put it more clearly, the new covenant standard is not a set of rules. The new covenant standard is God's character. And here's why that's so important. When it's rules, you can find a loophole. When it's rules, you can create a workaround. And the more rules, the better, because the more loopholes. Why do you think the Pharisees added rules on top of 613 rules? It's ultimately so they could develop their workarounds and their loopholes. And Jesus calls them out on it all the time. His favorite nickname for the Pharisees is hypocrites. Because they claim to be following all the rules, but they're not. They've concocted workarounds. But when it comes to following God's character, and the Christian claim is that in Jesus we get an accurate picture of God's character, there's no end to that. There's no workaround to that. God's character is God's character. When that becomes your standard, it just compels you and pulls you more and more in God's direction. There's no workaround. Jesus gives us one example of God's character. He says, God causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. Set of rules says the good get rain and the bad get none. The righteous, they're the ones that get some sun. The unrighteous get none. That's what rule says. That's what's fair. But God's character allows the sun and the rain to benefit all. Jesus sums up this whole section with this. Be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect. And this would be absolutely crushing on our souls if we were still stuck in a rule-following mindset. 603 or 613 plus an additional set, whatever your standard is. I mean, you don't even have to go to the Old Covenant. If it's about following a set of rules, you know this. You struggle to follow even your own standard. And if Jesus is saying you got to be perfect in following that standard, this is crushing. Luke, who records a version of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, he translates it in a different way. He says, be merciful, just as your heavenly Father is merciful. Mimic the character of God. Let God's character be your standard. That's what it means to be perfect. Or to put it this way, perfection is moving in God's direction. It's not trying to follow God's commands. It's trying to follow God's character. And God's character is revealed to us through the person of Jesus Christ, who comes and he says this to everyone he meets. Follow me. Follow me. Pattern your life after mine. So here's the application. Here's what I suggest you do. Set your standard on God's character rather than God's old covenant commands. It's far simpler, but it is far more demanding. It's far simpler because you just need to remember one thing. Let me look to Jesus. Let me see what he would say about this. And next week, I'm going to show you how simple it is, because Jesus takes 613 commands and he boils it down to one. Just one. You just need to know this one thing. We're going to talk about it next week. But make that shift. I know there was two, but it's really one. You were not created to be a rule follower. This is what I believe. This is what I think Jesus would tell you. You were not created to be a rule follower. You were created to be a Christ follower. It's something better. It's a righteousness that surpasses the righteousness of the Pharisees, of the best rule followers on the planet. Or to put it a different way, you were made to shine light, not avoid darkness. This is not a sin avoidance club. This is a bunch of people that understand that even at our best effort, we can't fully avoid sin. We can't follow all the rules. And so we've come to the end of ourselves and we're ready to receive the grace of God. And when we allow that into our hearts, it transforms us and allows us to be a vessel of that grace. We are able to shine that light.